So first of all, welcome to our lunchtime conversation with Jeff Chang, author of We Gonna Be All Right, the subject of our Recreate Reading conversation this morning. On behalf of the Harker Diversity Committee and the greater Harker community, thank you for hanging around to continue our conversations. The last sentence of our mission statement reads, "We honor individuality, embrace diversity, and promote leadership and service, preparing students to take their place as global citizens." Key to fulfilling this facet of our mission includes helping students learn about their own identities as well as others, learn to view the world through multiple lenses, and learn ways to frame, analyze, and discuss diversity, equity, and justice. In this way, we support our students as they grow into their future selves. As you've probably noticed in recent months, we've struggled as a nation to have fruitful conversations about individuality, diversity, leadership, and service. The reality is that we've struggled with this conversation for more than 400 years. If we are to embrace inclusion and become global citizens, we have a moral obligation to improve our ability to talk about these subjects, to talk about race, to talk about justice and equity. To that end, we get to have this chat about these subjects with Jeff Chang. Jeff Chang is the director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford and the author of 3 books, including Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation, which, personally speaking, was the backbone of a hip hop unit I used to teach when I taught African American studies. He was born and raised in Hawaii and attended Berkeley and UCLA. Currently a Bay Area local, he was named by the Utne Reader as one of 50 visionaries who are changing your world, by KQED as an Asian Pacific American local hero, and by the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts as one of its 2016 YBCA 100 list of those shaping the future of American culture. He's now working on a book about Bruce Lee. Mr. Chang, thank you very much for coming. I want to open it up to questions for you guys.
So I'm the executive director at Stanford University for a unit called the Institute for Diversity in the Arts. I'm a writer. I was a writer before this, and I'll be a writer after this. And when I'm dead, they'll say that I was a writer. I took a long time to get to that, and if any of you want to ask how I got there, I could take the next hour talking to you about that. Suffice it to say that you don't have to have decided what you need to do for the rest of your life by the time you enter college. Not even when you graduate college, not even when you graduate your graduate studies, not even after that. So just to say that I've taken a very roundabout route, but I got to this place where I've been a writer. And I've been writing a lot about arts and culture, about cultural movements, and about the question of race and identity for about the last 25 years or so. Can't Stop, Won't Stop, A History of the Hip Hop Generation was a book that was about the rise of the hip hop movement, but placing it in the context of the social history and a cultural history of the US over the last 50 years. Who We Be, A Colorization of America was a book that was about arts and visual culture, about the way we see race, literally. And We Gonna Be All Right, Notes on Race and Resegregation is a book that came out last year that's trying to get at the heart of some of the questions that we're facing right now in the country around division, polarization, around these really dangerous and divided times that we're living in now. So I'll just start with that as a warm-up, and you know, we can take this conversation where we wanted to take it.
I think there was a question here. Do you have a question?
Okay.
Go.
Hi. My question was, like, what inspired you to start researching and getting into this field of like hip hop? And yes.
Yeah, sure. So I was a kid growing up in Honolulu, Hawaii. The music that I used to listen to back then was sort of Hawaiian folk music, guitar music. Listened to a lot of what they call now yacht pop, pop music that's about that's very languid and cheesy, super cheesy, and Hawaiian folk music that was largely played on guitar. And then I heard reggae, actually. There was a radio station on Maui, I lived in Honolulu, that certain times of the night when the cloud cover came in, you could get this FM station and they'd be playing these weird sounds that I'd never heard before. Songs about like fighting and standing up for your rights and jamming and stuff like that. And I'm like, wow, this is reggae. This is really amazing. And so when I was 12, on the radio, Rapper's Delight came on. And I think like every other kid in my school, I wanted to learn all the lyrics immediately. And so all the time we'd be rapping this to each other in the hallways. And I got a little older and found out that there was this whole culture attached to it. And that it was this whole way of walking, swag, right? This sort of swag. It was this whole way of talking. It was a whole way of presenting yourself in the world. And that there was like a dance that was associated with it. There was like a visual art. I was like a visual artist at the time. That there was a whole sort of musical thing, like with the DJ, 2 turntables, and the MC. And I just wanted to learn everything that there was to learn about it. So I became a tagger. I would tag my name all over the place. I tagged Slim. And I wasn't very good at that. And eventually I learned how to DJ. I moved to California, met a lot of folks that were involved in the scene, learned how to DJ, and became a DJ. And I eventually started writing about it because I was working at radio stations and I'd have access to all these artists. And I had just had a passion for it. And as the movement kind of evolved, it started to speak more to social issues. And so this was kind of happening at the same time that I was becoming a lot more conscious about questions of race in my own life. And so when I actually began writing about hip hop, I was writing a lot about hip hop from the point of view of thinking about these social issues. A lot of these social issues actually led up into 1992, the Los Angeles riots, which was, I think, a really crucial historical moment in my life, certainly, and in the life of a lot of people my age. And I just didn't stop, writing after that. And it's sort of, so I've continued to write about that. I'm really interested in the question of how the arts allow us to see things differently, how the arts provide a place for us to imagine a different kind of future, how the arts provide a place for us to be able to represent our own stories, tell our own stories. And hip hop for me became that vehicle to be able to eventually tell my own story. So, yeah.
Hi. In your diversity chapter, you mentioned, you posed a really important point that for schools, like what was the minimum threshold of color necessary for an acceptable presentation of diversity? So I just wanted to ask you what your personal opinion of, what would that be?
I just think that our culture needs to be able to represent the diversity of the society that we all live in. And when I was coming of age during the 1980s and 1990s, I was learning from a lot of professors who were beginning to sort of tell the stories of different folks who had been written out of American history, right? And they called it multiculturalism at the time. And so I was very inspired by professors like Ron Takaki, who kind of wrote the first big multicultural history of the US. And I was also inspired by a lot of writers from Ishmael Reed to Ntozake Shange to Jessica Hagedorn, a lot of folks who had come out of the Bay Area, out of this sort of multicultural movement. And their argument was essentially that US had always been mixed up, right? That American culture had always been this mixed up thing, right? That what we had been taught, that we had to assimilate into a certain kind of way of being American was kind of crazy, that America had always been this really mixed up type of thing. So I took that to kind of heart, And I think that what we also saw during that particular period when I was coming of age was there was this huge backlash against that idea that there were multiple ways to be American. Like, it's really weird to think about just the word multiculturalism now. Because back then, if you talked about American culture, you were talking about a singular kind of thing, you know? And everybody else kind of assimilated to it. So just the idea of being multi, right? That culture could be multi was a paradox at that particular moment. Now it's like nobody cares about multiculturalism because we move way past that, right? But back then it was like a big thing. And if you can imagine, there were all kinds of people who were saying we shouldn't be teaching students about the history of people of color because that's not the story of America. If we accept that Ebonics is, you know, a way, a variation of English, then we're dumbing down the curriculum around English. We're not teaching people how to speak proper English, right? As if there couldn't be different ways of living, multiple different ways of living at the same time. And so at this particular point in history, we're at a point now where diversity is like the norm. It's like what we're all supposed to be about, right? And yet, and we were talking about this earlier today, if you look at the people who are making decisions around like what the culture should be, the people who are making decisions in Hollywood, people making decisions on Broadway, in the museums, right? And TV and all the other kinds of places, it's still very much what it looked like in the 80s and all the way back to the early 1900s. And so I asked that as a rhetorical question, you know? What's the threshold, right? What is the cap that people want to put on that type of thing, right? We're finding that we're in a moment, and this happens often if you look back, especially over the last 50 years, where there is a moment of crisis that happens in the streets, right? And then it forces the whole country to think about race again. And so we're in a moment now where that's actually pushed a lot of the people who are decision makers to think about like, oh, well, maybe we should greenlight a movie like Moonlight, or maybe we should greenlight a movie like Get Out. Like, and then it's being proven again that there's a huge audience for these kinds of movies, right? And we have to kind of continue to prove this over and over again. So I feel like there's no sort of minimum threshold, but as long as certain stories are out there that are being marginalized, that we're not really having a reflection back of what the huge and amazing kind of richness of America is about, you know? And that leads us to again, to reinforce this notion that there's only one way to be American. So, yeah, thank you.
So in your book, you outline a cycle that's persisted since, I think you say 1965. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a reasonable assessment to say that our recent election was the backlash stage of that cycle, mm-hmm. Predominantly based on the insecurities of the white middle class. But I think that the radicalism and extremism that we've seen emboldened in certain contingents of President Trump's base seems to make us more, I think, firmer in our own convictions and mm-hmm. more fully entrenched in our own ideologies. Mm-hmm. And since that election, I think that we've seen, a huge youthful wave of activism, like the Women's March, protests at airports, many social justice projects have been launched. And people are even turning to government as a means of implementing the change they want to see. People are like writing to their local representatives and going to town halls mm-hmm. And lobbying for what they want. And I think that, or I guess my ultimate question is that, do you think that this wave of activism will descend into complacency and the cycle will persist, or do you think that this extreme polarization will allow us to break free from this cycle?
Can I get how long do I have to answer? You're killing it today, Alicia. You're killing it. So I think, okay. I think it's an interesting question. Usually when I'm talking about the book, it's framed as like the question of, come on, Jeff, are we really going to be all right? given all the stuff that's going on, are we going to be all right? And I think that I'm the one who's usually having to say, hey, we've been through this before, right? We've seen the sort of backlash situation happen constantly through history. It goes back way before 1965, all the way back to 1865, right? We can go back to 1765 and talk about these types of questions, right? What I was trying to point out is that there is a way in which we come back again and again to a sense of amnesia about the question of race in the US. And that's because we have a moment of crisis, and then there's a reaction to that, and people start moving, talking like maybe we should be doing some changes, making some changes here, and then there's a backlash. And this election was absolutely the backlash, as you pointed out. And then there's a moment where we get exhausted with talking about this. In some ways, the moment right before the election of Obama was that. People were like, do we still have to talk about this race stuff? And then the sort of Jeremiah Wright controversy pops up, and suddenly people are polarizing again, and that sets the groundwork for this backlash to begin, with Trump, talking about birtherism, like was he really born in Honolulu, all that kind of stuff, sending his squad of researchers to Honolulu to find out if that really happened, all that kind of stuff, right? And this leads to this sort of ongoing backlash now that we've been in for about 10 years. So the thing that I like to say is that we're in a moment where we actually have to determine where the country is moving to. The culture wars started up, all of this stuff kind of started up as this sort of backlash against the uprising of folks who are trying to say we haven't been included in the American narrative, right? And we think that America could be better. And so you've got that on one side, that's one narrative, that's one story. And then on the other side, you've got this story about the America that's falling apart, that's deteriorating, that's lost or is losing something forever and ever, and that will never be able to be recovered. And so we therefore need to make America great again, right? So it's this hopeful narrative, this emerging country, and it's this narrative of white supremacy, we've lost something, we're never going to be able to run this like the way we used to, right? And that's what the culture wars are about. In order for us to get out of this, move out past the culture wars, we have to figure out what it means to forge a new majority. And the thing is, demographically, we're all minorities now, at least in California, right? And so what we have to do is culturally and politically figure out how we're going to form this new majority, right? We haven't done that yet. All numbers show that there's maybe at most a third of the country that really is part of what we might want to call this Trump base, right? And it correlates, there's an article actually in today's Washington Post, it correlates that the number of folks who think that the country is still going on the right track correlates with the number of folks who believe that Trump actually does care about minorities, right? It correlates exactly. So this is about a third. That means that we have 2/3 of the country that's this new majority, and yet we haven't figured out how to determine what that's going to look like, what the values are that we're going to stand for, what the policies and procedures and ideas and protocols and judgments that define what we make up as a society, what those are going to be, and ultimately what kind of culture we're going to be able to advance into the next, whatever, century. And so if we're all going to be minorities, or if we all are minorities, how do we form a new majority? And that's not a question that we're going to be able to answer. When I say we, I mean people who are post-young, right? All of you who are pre-young and young in this room, that's going to be your question. So it's the most important question that you'll be dealing with in your lifetimes, right along with the question of how are we going to figure out the most intersectional issue of all, which is climate change, right? Climate change, and how do we figure out what this new majority is going to be about? Like, those are the two questions that you need to figure out. So ultimately, it's going to be up to you to figure out if we're going to be all right or not. Yeah.
In the discussion that we had in the morning, you touched upon the model minority myth, particularly amongst like the sort of portraying the Asian American community as sort of like a example of success as an obedient minority group. And you also mentioned, you're talking about how like it's sort of been almost embraced, not only by like white America, but sort of like amongst Asian American communities themselves. Hence this, and which contributes to like a growing divide between like the Asian American community and like Black and Latino communities. So, what steps do you think that should be taken in order to sort of like foster a sense of like solidarity amongst the Asian American communities and the Black and Latino communities?
Well, I think it ultimately comes down to taking a stand on this question of racial justice. Are we going to be about, trying to move the whole country towards justice and equity? Or are we going to try to reinforce these structures that have kept us divided and that have led to a growing inequality between the classes and between the races? And so Asian Americans play a really crucial role in this. We were talking about the idea that the model minority myth is sort of a way to be able to pit different groups against each other, right? In the same way that people actually want to pit the white working class against the rest of the country, right? We have to be able to figure out ways that we can align ourselves with each other to move towards justice and equity. And Asian Americans, as a racialized minority, as folks who do face a lot of discrimination, but who also do have racial privilege, we have to be able to say that we recognize our racial privilege and we want to be able to work towards undoing that privilege so that we can all be free together. And I think it's really crucial for Asian Americans to play that role, especially in places like California, because we're a large plurality. And I think that what we see happening in the community is that 2/3 of Asian Americans support affirmative action, for instance. 2/3 of Asian Americans vote Democratic. But there's a very loud minority of folks within the Asian American community that's actually very well funded. And so this is an issue that's, continuing to play out. It played out over the last couple of years in New York City, in Brooklyn, right? In the case of a police officer who fired a shot that killed an African American, Akai Gurley, in the stairwell. And Asian Americans rallied and said, well, Peter Leong's being treated wrong, right? As a policeman, he should be given the same kind of privileges that all of the white policemen who have been acquitted of killing Black people should be given. And that, I think, illustrates a sort of misunderstanding, a perversion of the idea of racial justice. And so you saw a lot of Asian Americans rallying in support of Akai Gurley and the family to get at the issues of over-policing, of police brutality, and of the seeming inability of the state to convict any kind of police person of extrajudicial killings. And this is going to be going on and on and on. In different types of issues that come up, different folks are going to be pitted against each other in these kinds of fundamental ethical questions. And so as Asian Americans, we have to be able to arrive at sort of an ethical and a moral stance for our politics. It can't just be about everything should come to us because we've been historically marginalized. We have to be able to be aware of the role that we play in society and what our responsibilities and duties and debts are to other people around us. So, yeah, thank you.
questions?
Hi there. Thank you for coming, first of all. You mentioned earlier in this talk crisis in the streets, and we have had two so-called crises in the streets just this month, one in Charlottesville, the other in Berkeley. And we have seen many, especially in the liberal camp, come out and say that people organizing for community defense against fascists are oftentimes as bad as the fascists themselves. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on whether or not liberalism really is something that we can leverage to combat these neo-fascist elements.
Liberalism in what way? It's a broad category, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the more mainstream liberalism that we've seen, that is the so-called resistance that really argues only for peaceful protest and says that any kind of forceful resistance to these elements is unwarranted or has no place.
Well, from a personal point of view, I'm somebody who believes in nonviolence, but I also study martial arts and self-defense. I don't think that that's a contradiction, because I think that what it means is that I work towards building community, towards trying to do restorative justice, to repair harms, to try to bring people in, to never assume that anybody is beyond redemption, right? And yet, if somebody is attacking me with a pole, I'm not going to allow myself to be beaten to a point where I can't continue to do that job. And I'm certainly not going to allow them to do that to my family or the ones I love or the community that I love. So I see a lot of interesting debate these days around the question of free speech. And what I do believe is that if you are arguing for free speech and then you're coming to a rally with a loaded gun, or you're getting into a car with the intention to harm, that's not free speech. That's actually an intimation of hate speech. And I think that it's okay for communities to say, we don't stand for that. We don't stand for that. And there's different ways that people can express not standing for that. They can be an elected official who decides that they won't approve that permit, or they could be a person in the street with 50 other people saying, not here, right? And I think that that's a fair way to be able to take care of that question. The conundrum, of course, is that we want to advocate and we want to build communities that are based on inclusion, that are based on openness, right? That are based on redemption, right? That are based in these ideas of justice and equity. But that always means that we're under threat from folks who don't believe in any of that, who believe in closing things down, carrying guns to their so-called free speech rally, right? We believe in ideas that are actually contradictory to protect, right? And so that puts us in a bind, I think, sometimes. But I think that on those outer edges of this particular kind of debate, that free speech is not absolute, right? That intolerance is not necessarily something that we should tolerate. And so I think that it's perfectly okay for us to be able to say that no, white supremacy, white nationalism, particularly the violent kind, the type that has the intention of harming not just with words but with weapons, that's beyond the pale of what we can actually tolerate. Yeah.
You did a lovely job talking about free speech. I'm really curious about equity in education and how to bring that about.
Dropping the mic right there with that. Well, this goes to so many things. I mean, the book is about resegregation, right? The book is about the way that we've allowed for the dismantling of the structures that would move us towards educational equity, cultural equity, economic equity. Over the last 50 years, we've allowed these structures to be dismantled. And so fundamentally, what we have to build is a cultural move towards a new consensus for racial justice and educational equity and cultural equity and economic equity and all these other types of things that come with it. Resegregation has been a norm for this entire generation, right? School desegregation peaked in 1989. And since that time, what we've seen is the development of sort of a bifurcated system, so that the average white student goes to a school that's 75% white, lives in a neighborhood that's 75% white. I'm looking at national numbers now. I'm not talking specifically about San Jose or Saratoga. But it also means that Black and Latinos, the overwhelming majority of Black and Latino students, go to schools that are majority non-white. And that these questions are not getting better. In fact, as we discover more and more data around this type of question, because for many years data wasn't even being collected, that it's going to get worse and worse. And this is happening at exactly the moment that we're heading to become a majority-minority, so-called majority-minority country. And so those are questions that run very deep, right? They go to questions of taxation and where the taxation goes, which are larger questions in general, too, of what our social investment is meant to be, or disinvestment, right, is meant to be. And they go to questions of the free market in housing. They go to questions of affordability, which of course is central to everything that we talk about with regards to housing here in the Bay Area. We're like ground zero for that. So these are really complicated issues. These are really, really deep issues. What we've had, though, I think, especially in K-12 education over the last like 2 decades, has been an obsession with the numbers and with testing, right? And that's moved us away from the fundamental issue of opportunity, the fundamental issue of access, and the fundamental issue of integration, school integration. And so we're arguing these proxies for these issues that we like are saying we don't want to talk about. And so I don't know how we get back to having this sort of open conversation, but we have to be able to do that in order to get to these fundamental questions. And I think that those of you, again, who are here, who are young, these are the kinds of questions that you all are going to be taking up, I think, during your lifetimes. This is going to be the work of your generation to be able to do.
Question over here? I think a hand's going up, no? Okay. Yes, sir. Okay.
So you mentioned the beginnings of the culture war, and being post-young myself.
Couldn't tell.
I also, what I remember about sort of the beginnings of the culture war is that it was and is, I think, intricately related to class warfare. And you sort of skirted around that issue a little bit, but not being a cultural critic myself, I don't really keep on top of these things. So I was just wondering if you could comment maybe on how the sort of link between sort of the racial side of culture warfare and the class side of culture warfare has evolved.
Wow, that's a huge question. But I think that, gosh, where do I start with this? I think that part of the culture wars is to be able to provide a ready scapegoat that demagogues can point to for the white working class to see as the cause of their problems. So what we know is factually, right, that all of the claims that that Trump's been making about immigrants, for instance, are way off the mark, right? And what we know is that a lot of the folks who are ready to believe these arguments are not necessarily people who are, say, living very close to the border, or in the case of Trump, attacking black communities in Chicago, right, for the violence that's happening there, the gun violence that's happening there, not living near the city, right? So it's a digression, right? The culture wars are the classic digression. It's a diversionary tactic, right? Rather than talk about the number of guns that are on the streets in Chicago, right? Let's talk about the failure of communities there to keep the peace and the inability of the states to be able to handle their own business. Let's federalize, send the National Guard in to the south side and the west side in Chicago where black and brown people live to end this stuff, right? Let's build the border up, right? Because all of these undocumented folks, all these illegal aliens are increasing crime. What we know is that even before Trump became president, that immigration, net migration from the South was already at zero or negative, right, because of the economy. And that by far, immigrants are the least likely to be able to commit crimes across the board. And so the culture wars literally work on fake news. And it's a way to be able to split the electorate from being able to find these answers that might be able to move us together to address questions of economic inequality. If you want to find the most progressive platforms around the issues of the day, from over-policing, right, to the question of immigration, the question of economic justice, like, we have to look at the Movement for Black Lives platform. We have to look at the platform that was put out around the Women's March, right? When folks come together, they figure out these issues are connected. And that's the threat, I think, to Trump and the elites around that. I think the culture wars play a very specific role in keeping us from being able to make that cultural shift towards, finding solutions, towards moving us towards community that's more open and inclusive and lifts everybody up. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I could talk about hip hop if you all want to talk about hip hop. I can't all day and all night, but are we running out of time?
We
are. Okay, sorry.
You guys have a class starting in like 7 minutes. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.